right. Everybody, welcome to this panel on election integrity. Microphone's working okay before we get started? Okay, great. I'm Josh Findlay. I'm the director of the Election Protection Project here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. The Election Protection Project is our national election integrity initiative. So we don't only focus on election integrity in Texas, hence the panelists today. We focus on the battleground states. So last election cycle, we did work in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, and a little bit in North Carolina at the end. Thank you. Now, I'm supposed to introduce these panelists, and I'm going to be very brief about that, first of all. And second of all, I am not going to read their bios. They are all very prominent in their fields. You can go and read their bios. They're written out in the programs, and you can get that. I'm going to try to be a little bit more personal here, because all of these panelists were chosen for a specific reason. One, they are at the absolute top of their fields in the administration, in the legislative branch, and in the activist grassroots legal movement. These are the top experts. To have them on a panel right now is very special. It's just an amazing thing nationally. But second of all, they are great human beings. They are patriots, and they are doing election integrity for the right reasons. First, to my far left, we have Chairman now, Don Palmer. He is the chairman of the Election Assistance Commission. He has been a conservative fighting in the administration for years, through Democrat presidents. Now with a Republican president, he has a whole new set of tools that he can use as far as election administration to hold our local administrators accountable. One of the biggest complaints I hear is that, election administrators do what they want a lot. Well, Don is the person who now has a new set of tools to be able to help hold those administrators accountable, and has just been a conservative fighting this battle, like I said, for years through Democrat administrations and everything else. Next to him, we have Chairman Bryan Steil from the U.S. House Committee on Administration. He's a member of the House of Representatives from Wisconsin. When I look at who has been a national leader on election integrity for years, it is the chairman with his committee. They have been holding hearings in a Democrat-controlled Congress on controversial topics. When Republicans took control of the House, they accelerated that and drew attention to issues that the mainstream media wasn't paying attention to. Issues like when they ran out of ballot paper in Pennsylvania and people weren't allowed to vote. That is the real voter suppression. And a lot of times the congressman, the chairman, and his committee were the lone voices highlighting these issues. And when I say that his team has been on the ground for elections every step of the way, as much as any other grassroots group, I mean that. And so it is an honor to have the chairman with us today. And then finally, Cleta Mitchell. I just gave a speech in the other room, and I said sometimes the fights in election integrity are against the liberal left, and sometimes they're against people that should be on your own side. One thing that I can say about Cleta is that she is a fighter no matter what, and I owe her personally a tremendous amount, and the Texas Public Policy Foundation and our Election Protection Project owes her a tremendous amount for even being in existence today. So Cleta, thank you for coming and joining us. It really is an honor to have all of these guests with us. So we're going to start off with one question for everybody. As panelists, you can take this question and answer it and also give kind of a brief introduction, however you'd like to start out with. But the biggest question that I get asked right now is, what is the difference in the 2020 election and the 2024 election? What changed in those 4 years? And I think one thing that we can point to, of course, is Donald Trump won in an election that was too big to rig, right? But there were also a lot of election integrity changes that happened along the way. So from each of your unique vantage points, what did you see as the differences? And Chairman Palmer, let's start with you.
Sure. I think that, and I'm sort of stealing from one of the secretaries, Michael Watson. I interviewed him recently. And I'll just use his little southern twang. There were a lot more eyeballs on this election. And that's really a summarizing way of saying that conservatives were much more engaged and focused on the details of where you can make a big difference, and that is observing the election process and saying something when you see it, and working with your election officials locally to let them know that there's a lot of priorities they have on their plate, and that conservative principles of transparency and observation of the election are important, and they need to be part of that. I think that, and that's what we saw. I think we saw much more activism on the right, and just take the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Being in multiple states, being in key areas, in polling places, in offices, that sort of thing, that really makes a difference, because I've been in those shoes as an administrator. I know that when eyeballs are on you, you're complying with the law fully, you're making sure both sides are comfortable with the process as you go through that process toward election night and election results. So I'll just leave it at that. I think that was the big difference.
Thank you. Chairman Steil.
I'll build on that. I always say when the cat's away, mice will play, and there were a lot of eyes on this. The grassroots were engaged, and that is a really positive thing. From the Committee on House Administration, we had election observers sent to critical locations all across the country. 2 days after the 2024 election, I actually went to Los Angeles County to Central Count. Arrived, and there was a whole host of Democrat staff members, actually, and members of Congress that showed up once they found out I was coming. That's a good thing. We want people to be on their toes, knowing that we are going to come and observe the process. But if I can build on that slightly, to build on what you said, we also have made incremental, not transformational yet, but incremental progress on laws in particular states across the country. States like my home state of Wisconsin or the state of Pennsylvania successfully banned Zuckerbucks, the private funding that's going into elections. We should ban that from the federal level, that no state can do it, but we're making some level of incremental progress. And another important point is I think we're actually proving the case theory that says if you pass election integrity legislation, what you'll actually do is improve people's confidence in their elections, have safe, secure elections, but also when people are confident in their elections, more people will participate. And I think one of the things that we've seen is if you go back to the statements when Georgia passed their election integrity legislation, and President Biden called that legislation Jim Crow 2.0, and if you may remember, Major League Baseball bought into this. They moved the All-Star game out of Atlanta. I think they moved it to Colorado. And then you can go back and look with empirical data as to what happened. And the University of Georgia does a robust study on this that says, how did people feel about the election in the state of Georgia in 2022? So I'm going back one. And what they saw was that people were pleased with how the election operated, and that's across all key demographic groups. So that's true for whites, for blacks, Hispanics, Asians, veterans, women, across the board. And what we've seen now in 2 elections is participation rates at a high level in the state of Georgia, proving that the left's narrative about putting in place election integrity legislation is false. The left's narrative is false, which sets us up going forward to have a huge opportunity to put in place true, substantive, the transformational election integrity reforms that Cleta, that others of us are working on, and I think we have a huge opportunity in front of us.
Thank you. Cleta?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It is not often that an Oklahoma Sooner is invited to the University of Texas campus, so I'm very grateful. And I just echo what Don and Chairman Steil have said. Don and I have been working in the field of election integrity for well more than a decade. We're really old. And as I've said to some of the people that we've worked with, who don't really like all these new people who are engaged, I said, did you like it better when there were only 5 of us who knew the problems? But what happened after 2020 was that citizens across this country woke up on November 4th of 2020 and said, what just happened? And I found a PowerPoint I had presented to a large group of conservatives in 2013. I presented at the end of the year this PowerPoint saying, this is what the left has said they're going to do. There was a big group of left-wing leaders who gathered in January of 2013. Now remember, this is right after Obama's been reelected, and they pledged that they were going to change the political system of America. And they spent a decade, and the Capital Research Center estimates between $11 and $14 billion changing how Americans vote. because they believe, the left believes, if you change the process, you will change the outcome. And we're never going to have their money. We are never going to have their number of groups. They have groups of groups and networks of networks, and we're never going to have that. But what we have, and what has been developed, and this is the perfect answer to your question, is we have patriots all over the country. I founded the Election Integrity Network under the sponsorship of the Conservative Partnership Institute in Washington, where I joined in February of 2021 after my law firm and I decided to part company because I was one of President Trump's lawyers in the post-election Georgia in 2020, apparently a mortal sin. But we now have 22 state election integrity coalitions, and we hope to have another 10 strong coalitions by the end of the year. And we operate national working groups on everything from cleaning voter rolls to protecting vulnerable voters to understanding the role of the post office and the mail voting system. And there are literally hundreds of people around this country who have devoted thousands and thousands of volunteer hours over the last 4 years. And I started a Friday call for 1 hour every Friday. I started it in 2021 to fight H.R. 1 and what the Democrats were trying to do. They wanted to make California election laws federal laws. And we will always have to be grateful to Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema because they kept that from happening. But I started this coalition call in February 2021, and it's Josh and Byron. Others can tell you, I don't know how to stop it. I've been doing it for 4 years, every Friday, except for a holiday. I'm always grateful for a holiday. But it's amazing to hear what these people have done and are doing. And I have to give a shout out to Mike Ryden, who's been very generous to help us fund some of these projects last year in key states, adopting clerks, preparing handbooks that were hand-delivered by volunteers in each county, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, telling them here's what the law is, here's what the law says. And many, many more things. The voter rolls of this country are a complete mess because of federal law. And we have now many volunteers across the country who can tell you chapter and verse about what's wrong. So you want to know the difference between 2020 and 2024? It is patriots. It is citizen engagement. Just like parents realized, I think we need to be looking at what those libraries are carrying in the way of books that my kids are reading. I think we need to know. We need to be going to those school board meetings. Same principle. Citizens have to be engaged in oversight of their election apparatus and their election officials and their election boards and the election process. And we have to build on it. I thought maybe everybody had washed their hands and say, okay, we're done after November. Has not at all, because here's what everybody understands. Trump's victory was almost like an executive order. He's never going to be at the top of the ticket again, although I guess yesterday there was some confusion about that. But we have to codify the changes in the law. We have to make the changes in the federal law. We have to make changes in the state laws. And we have to make permanent accountability, transparency, and accuracy. And that's what we're about now.
Thank you for that. So going back to a couple of things that you both remarked on, changes in the law, and then Chairman Steil, you talked about the Congressional Observer Program. A lot of people don't know this because everyone thinks Congress has a hard time getting things done, but Chairman Steil actually got a bill passed to put teeth into the Congressional Observer Program. Chairman Steil, if you could take a minute and tell us a little bit about how that program was expanded, but also what other legislative priorities there are before Congress right now when it comes to election integrity.
Sure, I'll touch on the Congressional Observer Program. So this is a program, the United States House of Representatives is the final arbitrator of House races, not of all races, of House races. And so under that constitutional authority, the House of Representatives had a small but important program that deployed House staff members to critical locations around the country. And what we did this last election is we took that program and put it on massive steroids, scaled it to a proportion that has never been seen before, and took trained staff members and deployed them across the country. Let me give you an example of where this was really important. In my home state of Wisconsin, in the central count in the city of Milwaukee, there's a substantive issue on how they were counting the votes. U.S. Senator Ron Johnson, the chairman of the party in Wisconsin as well, and a couple others, went down to Central Count. I got on the phone with a trained staff member from Mary Miller, a congresswoman from Illinois. Her staff member was on the ground, had been observing the process, had properly documented what he observed, what was going on, and immediately I jumped on the phone. Senator Johnson was closer to Milwaukee than I was located at that evening, and connected them, and we began the process, and they began and recounted the Central Count location in Milwaukee. Having trained observers on the ground is absolutely essential, as we did at the Los Angeles County Central Count, where I went out and joined those observers just after the election as that count was ongoing in LA County. And so getting legislation, not only through the House, but actually signed into law is the name of the game. In particular, there, we did it, but really, when we hold Republican control in the House, the Senate, and the White House, we have a huge opportunity to codify and actually make law. What are the priorities? And I think this is really important. We, from a committee standpoint, will talk about the oversight role, and you referenced that, where we held hearings on where they ran out of ballots in the state of Pennsylvania. We held a series of hearings on issues where very few people outside of the activist side, but on the official side, were engaged and working on. So hopefully we'll come back to that.
Definitely.
But then let's look forward. I think we have an opportunity for both comprehensive but essential election law reform. The ACE Act, the American Confidence in Elections Act, is an act that's been in process and edited. We're working right now on what I call ACE 2.0 to add and strengthen and put teeth into the ACE Act with lessons learned. Cleta Mitchell is the pro at this. Lessons learned that we've seen over the past election where we can further strengthen and reform this. 3 key buckets inside the ACE Act to think about. One are the reforms that are needed, things such as preventing non-citizens from voting in the United States. Absolutely essential. The SAVE Act will be coming forward. But also to make sure some of the weedy things, where Don's in the lead in this, making sure our databases are talking to each other. This is a less exciting topic outside of this room to probably talk about, but making sure that the Social Security Death Database is talking to the USCIS, which is talking to the SAVE database, which is talking back to your state driver's license process, and getting those databases to talk to each other, so we're not only removing non-citizens, we're removing duplicates, we're removing everyone who should not be voting in U.S. elections, removing them from the rolls. Those are the reforms. Item number 2 is I think we can use Washington, D.C. actually as a case study for what good election integrity legislation looks like. So if you're a federalist like me, your preference is for the states to have total control of their elections and the federal government to stand back. There's work where the federal government has to come over and force the states to comply, but that's your general core concept. The federalism argument, though, we actually have a true and substantive role in Washington, D.C., and I'd remind you to tell you how bad Washington, D.C. is. Under current law in our nation's capital, non-citizens are legally allowed to vote in municipal elections. And what we saw is a large number of non-citizens who voted legally under D.C. law in municipal elections just in 2024. So we need to clean up Washington, D.C., and as we showed with the Georgia election integrity legislation, we proved the case study at the state level. We have an opportunity to prove this at the national level with a gold standard in our nation's capital. And the final piece where we have a huge opportunity in front of us, and this is where the investigative side plays into the legislative side, is making sure that we have a clear and concise understanding of what's going on in our campaign finance system in the United States. We've done an investigation into ActBlue and other online fundraising platforms. What I have shown is ActBlue does not have and did not have the security protocols in place that they should have had in place to be operating in the manner that they are. We also proved that there was a loophole that allows foreign billionaires to transfer funds into a 501c organization, wash that money, transfer 40% of those funds to a US-based super PAC to run campaign ads driving forward a political agenda. We need to close that loophole on foreign funds. And so if you think about what we're trying to do from a House perspective, it's the broad and big reforms that are needed from the federal level to make sure states are doing the right thing. Make Washington, D.C. actually a gold standard of election integrity, and then address the campaign finance system. And there's a lot of work to be done. We got a short amount of time, but we got some great partners helping us out.
If I want to, you have a handout If you want somebody to hold that up, I forgot to bring one up. On the front side of it, on this side, if you go to votefair2026.com, this is a compilation of the input of citizen leaders from all across the country who I asked in October, I started thinking, well, if we did win, what would we want to do? And Josh can tell you this because he's worked with all these people. And they sent in all these different, here's what we need to change. Here are the statutes we need to change. Here are the things we need to fix. Some are at the state level, some are at the federal level. But it's all compiled into 10 principles, the U.S. Citizens Elections Bill of Rights. And all of the things that we really need to address are in this set of principles somewhere. So this is a summary of the 10 principles, but underneath it on the website are many more. And on the back is polling data that has just been released. It's not been released yet. We just got it. Scott Rasmussen poll tested what the American people think about the principles in the U.S. Elections Bill of Rights. And guess what? Keeping non-citizens from voting, let's see, that would be 87%, 86%.
Who are the 14% that oppose that?
Exactly. It's actually only 12. Well, they happen to be Democrats in Congress and the media and the academics. Requiring voters to show an ID that is only issued to a citizen of the United States. All but 5 states allow student IDs to be used for voting. Texas, by the way, is one of the 5, does not allow student IDs. But all the other states, 45 states, allow that. Well, guess what? You don't have to be a citizen to get a student ID. You don't have to be a resident of the state to get a student ID, and they all look alike. We need to change that. But all of these principles of election integrity are wildly popular with the American people. The lowest percentage of support for any of these principles is 59%. And that is for requiring hand-marked paper ballots and getting rid of ballot marking devices and touchscreens. I would argue that that's a little nuanced for a lot of people who don't pay attention to these issues all the time. My point is, there is so much work for us to do in Congress and at the state level. I'll just close by saying this. I agree the federalism issue is very important. However, Congress broke our system. And so Congress needs to fix it. Congress broke it with the NVRA. Congress has broken it with UOCAVA, the Uniformed Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. It's now, I always thought that was the military vote. I bet when this is all said and done after the 2024 election, it's going to be less than a third, maybe less than 25% military. It's mostly non-citizens. The Democrats have figured out you don't have to prove anything. You don't have to prove you're a citizen, and you don't even have to prove you live overseas. So I've actually sent some language to some Texas legislators about fixing that in Texas. We have a lot of work to do, but we've got a lot of people around the country now who know and are watching, so I'm very hopeful.
Thank you for that. So Don, this is a little bit of a nerdy crowd in here, which I love. We've got a lot of engineers, a lot of people who care a lot about the nuts and bolts of elections, right? How things happen. You, as part of the Election Assistance Commission, you deal with these nerdy things, and that's why we love you. Tell us a little bit about what's on the horizon. What have y'all been working on at the Election Assistance Commission? And now that we have, I think, a lot more support from the administration, how is that going to make your life easier?
Well, adequate resources is always important to make sure you get the job done. It really is. But I think that, going back to your original question, and we'll go into what I really see for the next couple of years. First of all, we really leaned into, we wanted to make sure integrity was part of the process. We have political appointees, then you have the agency, and we can guide the direction of the agency. We wanted to make sure that our testing, was state of the art. We added penetration testing. We wanted to be that first level with our accredited labs to make sure that the testing of those voting machines was 100%.
And just so people know, he's talking about one thing that they do is they test voting machines, they test electronic poll books, they test ballot scanning devices, all of this stuff. Like when you're wondering, is there anyone looking at the machines? That's what the Election Assistance Commission does.
That's right. And it's the first step. Then the state takes a look at it usually, and then the locals also do their testing. So you have folks on both sides of the aisle throughout this entire process. And so we wanted to lean forward on that. I felt that we could do more. I had come from Florida. We had an active testing program, and I wanted to do more when I came onto the commission. Now, looking forward, I think that we adopted a new generation of standards, VVSG 2.0 we call it. New generation of standards, but it's going to take some time to get there. But we want to highlight what will improve with that process. We have more paper ballots, more paper will be more part of that process. It allows you to audit more ballots, this new standard, which is what generally everybody wants in the process, both sides of the aisle. And it's more transparency. We can understand what is going on in the voting machine. The election official on the ground can understand that as well as observers. So that new standard is very important. If we can get there sooner, the better. Hopefully before the next presidential election, we have a lot of folks. Then there's a lot of audits. You've heard about the audit division here in Texas. There's other states that have implemented some sort of audits, risk limiting audits, other procedural audits, voter registration audits to make sure your voter rolls are clean. But it's all over the place. We want to create voluntary standards that are professional standards that as a body, as a national body, that the states can come to and say, oh, these are the best practices, we can adopt them. So we're going to be working on that this year with our experts at the AC and with states and experts. And the last thing is going to be, what can we do, research and sort of assistance to the states on list maintenance. Now, as the other panelists have talked about, that could be a lot. And so, my job has always been to try to make it work. Because the law is the law, and then you got to make it work within the bureaucracy and push it over the finish line. And so that's what you would do at the state level. That's what we could do at the federal level to assist the states. And so that's really what we have is those three main core trying to push the bureaucracy to improve with elections.
Perfect. I love that. Chairman Steil, one of the biggest complaints that we get is with local election administrators, right? They don't do a good job of, even when they mess things up, there's no accountability. One thing that your committee that we've talked about has been great at is holding people accountable. Tell us about your oversight function and some of these investigations that you're looking to do going forward.
Well, so let's look back 2 years. We were the only game in town that was willing to actually investigate and provide oversight of our federal elections outside of outside groups. And so when you have a Democratic Senate and a Democratic President Biden, we were trying to shine a light and push back against the excessive overreach of the Biden administration. In some areas, we were successful. We shined a light. We talked about the ballots running out in Pennsylvania. We've seen issues in the state of Wisconsin. We've seen issues around the country. Where we came up short, and where I think we have a huge opportunity now with President Trump, is in areas where the Biden administration continued to stonewall us. So Executive Order 14019, which is President Biden weaponizing every federal government agency to get out the vote, and when you explore that in an absolutely partisan manner. President Trump correctly terminates Executive Order 14019, but we still have to go back and look, what were the Democrats doing under this executive order, and why will they not give Congress and the taxpayers visibility into their strategic plans that they implemented in the course of the election of 2024. We have an opportunity as it relates to campaign finance. When we talk about the protocols in place and the security protocols in place at key online fundraising platforms, in particular ActBlue. That investigation has moved forward, but we're stonewalled by Biden's Department of the Treasury. Now with the Department of the Treasury coming under a Republican secretary, President Trump, we're going to have an opportunity to go and fully explore the SARS, suspicious activity reports. People that live in the world of banking know exactly what we're talking about. But this is where financial institutions observe a suspicious activity, file a report on it, but the Biden administration was blocking our Congress's ability to go and review those documents so we get a full understanding of exactly what's going on the back end of ActBlue and other online fundraising platforms. And then one area that I am uniquely concerned about that I don't think has really hit the mainstream is the impact that foreign funds are having in our elections. And we have proven and shown the federal loophole that allows these foreign billionaires to transfer funds into 501Cs, slush that through into super PACs and other areas. I referenced that earlier. But to really highlight this and then close that loophole from a legislative standpoint is essential. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time building the groundwork through the investigation side to prove to everyone exactly what's going on. I think there should be some core principles as you look at your Bill of Rights and we think about the polling on this. Should U.S. elections be for U.S. citizens? You said it was 84 or 86%, and I'm baffled it's not 100. But I think people also understand that when it comes from the funding standpoint, that you as a U.S. citizen have a right to participate and make a contribution to any candidate that you see that you feel interested in. A non-U.S. citizen does not have that same right. And so we need to close that loophole of these foreign funds. We're going to continue to highlight that in these investigations. But the good news is, for the next 4 years, we got a great President Trump who's going to help us in our oversight role rather than give us the Heisman and try to stiff-arm us.
That's exactly right. I'm going to tell a little bit of a war story here for a second about Chairman Steil, because we're here in Texas, okay? So a few years ago, Texas had a Harris County election administrator that a lot of people weren't fans of, right? Everybody starts laughing because they remember this. Well, I'm going to tell you something. Melissa Conway, who is here with us, was working for the RNC at the time. And we put together a war room in Texas where we started logging all of the issues that were coming in through Harris County. Well, Chairman Steil had a staff attorney on the ground in that war room logging all of the issues, paying attention to how terrible things were. And I'm telling you, it was so bad that we were on the phone with the Democrat county party chairman, and she was furious with everything that was happening at that time, right? It was so bad. This staff attorney took all of these complaints back to the committee. I think the committee was even controlled by Democrats at this time, if I remember. But either way, your office was the one driving this thing. They held a hearing. The hearing was so just egregious in everything that they exposed that this election administrator was removed from her position. And so Chairman Steil is up here talking about these big picture things, fundamental changes that need to happen, but also know that he and his staff are concerned about the nuts and bolts of the elections, and he's made a huge difference here in Texas alone.
I appreciate it. When you think about the role of oversight of Congress, I think it's, in some ways, it's one of the most important functions of your elected representatives in Congress. In shining sunlight on things that are going wrong, it's important to fix that one problem, but I think it's also really important to make the statement to everyone else that you're watching. And so it's a little bit of broken window theory, right? Of we are going to go and fix certain issues across the country. And from the federal level, you can't fix every single one. But I think it's really important for people to know across the country, in the election space in particular, that we are watching. And if we observe incorrect, inappropriate, illegal, egregious behavior, we're going to hold a hearing. We're going to investigate it. We're going to call you out, and the consequences should follow.
And thank you for that. We really appreciate it. So, Cleta, one thing that I feel like you and your organization, the Election Integrity Network, have specialized in is holding people accountable, right? One thing, well, look, we're from the South here, right? We've got the Waffle House. The best way to order hash browns is smothered and covered, right? I also think that is the best way to do election integrity. You put people in those offices, you smother anything that the left is going to attempt, and then you cover election season with poll workers, right? Cleta has been, a pioneer in that with the Election Integrity Network. Tell us a little bit about some of the victories that you have had, and inspire the grassroots in this room with the grassroots that you've seen across the country, and then also what they can do with the Citizens' Bill of Rights, how they can take this and maybe enact some of these things here in Texas.
Well, it's really there are so many examples. I'll give you something that I said this morning. I had a report from Michigan. I had the state election integrity chair from Michigan do just a look back at 2024 and then what they're working on 2025. It's pretty remarkable. And all the things that they did in 2024, they recruited over 1,000 volunteers who were willing to go into Detroit to Central Count. They had people with video cameras. Remember the reports from 2020 about how there were trucks coming in with ballots in the middle of the night? They recruited what they called their night watch party, And they had people at the warehouse with video cameras trained on the loading docks and at the place where, in 2020, the truck delivered ballots. And they watched all night with their cameras. And the truck left, and it went to the delivery point, but they saw the people with the cameras, and they never got out of the truck. And the other thing, when I first met Patrice Johnson, who is the head of the volunteer head, I might add, of the Michigan Coalition, she told me that after 2020, she and a group of 4 or 5 people were so upset, they sat down around a kitchen table and said, what can we do? Then they said, we don't know anything about this, but we think maybe legislation, maybe we need to work on the laws. So that's how they started. Now they have a weekly call with over 100 people every week. They have over 800 volunteers working on identifying the problems of the voter rolls. They call it souls to the rolls in Michigan. And now legislators in Michigan come to them and say, what do we need to change? What do we need to do? That's pretty far to come in 4 years. And I can give you many, many examples like that. But what we have to do next, I'm just very serious about this. Our next phase, what we have to do is we have to make these changes permanent. And, you know, look, we never have support of the media, ever. So we see these terrible situations where some election administrator is violating the law. And in the olden days, one would think, well, that's the kind of thing that the media would like to know about, right? Not so. I mean, I probably have had more negative column inches from the New York Times, The Guardian, ABC, CBS, Washington Post, all of these left-wing. New Year's resolution, never call them mainstream media. They are anything but mainstream. They are so out of the mainstream of America. So you call them whatever you want, lamestream, corporate, legacy, whatever, propaganda, state or government-owned media. Now we know they're getting our tax dollars. They buy hook, line, and sinker all of the attacks against election integrity volunteers and patriots. They call us names. We're election deniers. I don't deny that there was an election in 2020. I just deny that it was valid. And so I think that the most important thing is to realize that you can make a difference. You can make a difference at your local election office. They need to know that you're there. They need to know that you're watching. And then we need to make structural changes. And we need to make structural changes in the procedures. And look, here's the thing we have to always remember. The Declaration of Independence says, governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. I believe that the reason that the left and the Democrats were so willing to go so far left and so fast during the Biden administration was because I think they thought they'd broken the code and they were never going to lose another election. They were going to remove the election process, just like in California. You think that California voters have a real choice of candidates? No, because they have those jungle primaries that they nominate 2 Democrats. And that's what they want to do everywhere. So don't buy that. We need closed primaries. I know Texas has that weird system. Get rid of it. But the point is, they thought that they had removed the election system from the governed, from the people. I think they really believed that. I think that's why they were so shocked. And they're in such disarray because they believe if we control the process, we'll control the product. And the fact that Trump won despite that, but we lost House races we shouldn't have lost because of election laws. We lost Senate races we shouldn't have lost because of the election laws. And so if you don't think we don't have a lot of work to do, we do, because we have to make sure the election process itself does not predetermine a policy outcome. And that's what conservatives have never understood really until 2020, when they saw it with their own eyes. And I'm telling you, it's going to take all of us to try to wrest control of the election process away from the bad laws that have been passed over many, many years. And that's at the federal and the state level. And we can make it happen. The president has issued his election reform proposals. I've been keeping track. And they're all very popular, by the way. So we just have to make sure that we codify the things that are necessary to make sure that our election system produces accurate results, reflects the will of the people, is transparent, and where there is true accountability.
You know, it's really interesting. It seems kind of like old news now, but I think one of the biggest changes of this last election were the Zuckbuck bans that went through. That was driven by grassroots on the ground. And if you look at Georgia, my home state, they passed one Zuckbucks ban. It was bad, and so the grassroots drew attention to that, and they went and passed another kind of follow-up to that law to make sure that it took place. The efforts to get states out of ERIC, also driven by the grassroots. I mean, the impact that you all can have on the ground is just tremendous, and I think those are a couple of major structural advantages. All right, Chairman Palmer, you said you wanted to help fix voter rolls. So I've got a question here. I'm throwing something out here. DOJ has been getting a lot of access to databases, right? One thing that we have always heard complaints about is that the federal government does not share its information with the states. Like, I think there's a lot that could be done to improve voter rolls in the states if the federal government would just share information. What is the EAC going to do that you talked about earlier to help clean voter rolls? And do we have any hope with this new access to the different databases? Is there any way that we can get that information to the states to help clean voter rolls?
Well, it really is imperative. We've done a couple of pilots using commercial data to help on address list maintenance, where we actually would provide the resources for them to work independently with third parties to help clean their voter rolls. There's going to be a report out on that, but the EAC is structured that with Clearinghouse and some of its functions to serve as a facilitator for the states. And the key is, I've served at the state level, the states need that data that's at the federal level to help them maintain the accuracy of their voter rolls. There's going to be discussions about what, with USCIS and the citizenship information, and it really is a no-brainer that that sort of information should be available to the state election official to conduct list maintenance. And so I think the EAC can facilitate that process. That's what we do. We assist the states. We don't run the elections. We don't tell them what to do. We help them run their elections, or in this case, keep the voter rolls clean. One of the other things on the voter rolls is the databases don't communicate, and the chairman talked about this a little bit. This was one of the things in HAVA, the Carter-Baker Commission even envisioned that the state databases would communicate with each other. And the fact of the matter is the technology really wasn't there. Fast forward 20 years and we're still in business. This is how old we are. The technology probably is there. And so the EAC has been evaluating state databases. We want to make sure that they can communicate with each other, this next generation of voter registration systems, so they have the ability to communicate with each other. And why is that important? Well, when people move across and registered in multiple states, we have a patchwork of systems that don't really get the job done. We have to communicate better with each other. And I think the EAC can facilitate that process. We can do the research. We can provide some studies and solutions, and then we'll have these fundamental changes to our voter registration system. That's a lot of bureaucratic work, but that seems to be what I'm good at. I sort of like try to push the bureaucracy to do what the law is required. You know, we've implemented things when I was in Virginia and Florida. You know, it takes effort to implement voter ID or voter list maintenance. It takes prioritization, it takes resources, it takes personnel, and that's sort of pushing the bureaucracy, and that's really what we want to do to assist the states in receiving this data.
Perfect. So this one's a little bit for Chairman Steil and for Cleta. It has to do with non-citizen voting, a huge issue here in Texas. We know that this was pushed in the SAVE Act. So I would love to hear kind of what, Chairman Steil, your thoughts on what Congress thinks about the odds of getting something passed with non-citizen voting, you know, kind of what that act would do and how it would help with this issue. And then Cleta, tell us about how big this issue is in the states and what we need to do to pay attention to it and, you know, look at our own state laws. You talked about voter ID here in Texas and student IDs. What kind of things do we need to be looking at that at more of a local level?
I think the odds are actually pretty good. And so let's go back when the House passed the SAVE Act originally. I mean, everybody should vote for the bill. but that's not how Washington, D.C. is going to play out. But I'll offer you that 5 Democrats voted yes with every Republican in the House. And that was at a period of time when President Biden was still in office. And so now we have an opportunity to take the SAVE Act or the SAVE Act 2.0. There's some reforms that we can make in this space to make it even better. And to pass that out of the House, and now we have a partner in the Senate where John Thune can actually bring the bill up for a vote. And I don't know if you've noticed, but President Trump has a pretty big bully pulpit. And with that, what we can actually do is explain to the American people why this is important, how the bill works, defeat the Democratic lies about the legislation, and bring that bill forward. I think what you have to do is you have to get 7 Democrats to yes, but you can do that if you actually drive forward the narrative, go over the legacy media, or whatever other term you want to go. And that's where President Trump being in office gives us a huge opportunity to not only pass this in the House, but to get it through the Senate and signed into law. And as we look at the importance of this, I'll pass it to you, Cleta Mitchell, to kind of walk through how the states view this. But there are some states that are doing some really good stuff in this space. North Dakota, for example, when you get a driver's license in North Dakota, it's a real ID and it's labeled, if you're a citizen or a non-citizen, on your photo ID. That is then the ID you use when you go to vote. And so they can immediately verify, yes, you are not a U.S. citizen. Here is your ballot, vote, boom, boom, boom. So there are states that are doing this reasonably well, but not every state is doing that. And then the question is, how do you force that upon the states? And that's where this issue has become so significant. And we have states like Illinois and others that are issuing driver's licenses to non-citizens. So unlike North Dakota, Illinois, you can't tell when you get a driver's license as citizen or non-citizen. And so therefore, this type of legislation is going to be essential so that it's at a minimum on the voter rolls, although I think what North Dakota does is actually maybe the gold standard as it relates to photo identification.
Well, you know, every state, I'll just back up a bit. Last year, there were on the ballots in 8 states constitutional amendments, Wisconsin being one of them, and they all passed, stating in the Constitution of those states that only citizens can vote in elections in those states. And that would preclude, you know, these local left-wing jurisdictions from being able to say, well, we're going to let non-citizens vote in our local elections. That would foreclose that. And that follows, I think we're now up to 11, maybe 12 states that have put that in their state constitutions. Changing just one word, because usually the constitutions say something like under suffrage, all citizens of the United States can vote, and so it just changes it from all to only. But then what happens is, what is the state doing to implement? And that's a good question. I asked that question. I live in North Carolina. Our citizens, you know, we passed that with 65% support in November, and the legislature, controlled by the Republicans, has yet to introduce a single bill to implement it. And I've looked at the statute in North Carolina, and it's terrible. The voter registration statute's terrible. And the administration of voter registration in North Carolina is terrible. So every state needs to implement a process whereby it takes its voter rolls and compares it to the Department of Motor Vehicles data. Because guess what? Because of Real ID, because of the requirements of Real ID, every state is required. And now all the states, I mean, in May, if you don't have your Real ID, you won't be able to get on an airplane. You won't be able to go into a federal facility. But every state driver's license agency is required to obtain citizenship data or proof of lawful residence in the United States in order to issue a Real ID. So over the course of the last 10 years, what's happened is that the state DMVs, whatever it's called in your state, has the best data in the state of who is and isn't a citizen. Compare the voter rolls to that. And then if you find that there are people on your voter rolls whose citizenship status cannot be confirmed, then you can ask them to come in and prove that they're citizens in order to remain on the voter rolls. The problem that we have under federal law is that there is a 2013 Supreme Court decision that says that states who are required by the federal government to use the federal voter registration form And Arizona, bless their hearts, they've been trying since 2002 to be able to require proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. And the Supreme Court of the United States said that you couldn't have state-specific requirements. You couldn't ask people to provide documented proof of citizenship to register. Congress needs to fix that. That's one of those things. Congress broke it. Congress needs to fix it. But in the meanwhile, there is nothing that stands in the way of every state comparing its voter rolls to the state data, vital statistics data, DMV data, and really making an effort to ensure that only citizens are on the voter rolls. Just got to make them do it.
Can I add 100%? Can I add one quick comment? We need a paradigm shift about how we're thinking about data in this context. A lot of our systems and laws were set up when there were literal paper files, right? Social Security back in the 1930s was literally a paper file. So of course, it'd be irrational to think that you're going to go pull the paper file, check this, phone call back, or et cetera. We're now in a whole nother era, right? So data interoperability was a huge issue 20 years ago. If you didn't flawlessly type your phone number into a form with the dashes in the right spot and a 1 before the area code, it would reject your phone number. You'd have to try it 5 times. Now you type it in and kind of computer figures it out. That's data interoperability. And so when we think about all these databases, and not that the databases are perfect, but they're improving and we should make them perfect, but getting them to work together is a paradigm shift that we need on the back end on the laws to allow you to be able to do your job so that we can have clean voter rolls. And it needs to be a paradigm shift about how we're thinking about this, leveraging the technology for security purposes, and we can do this if we think a little bit differently about it.
That's a great reminder. That is an excellent reminder. Thank you for that. Okay, we are now going to open this up to Q&A. We have a runner with a microphone. Okay, so let's start in the front here and work our way back. We'll go with these three. So let's get to it.
Yes, we do the mail ballots in our county, and the issue's been with the federal postcard application. And so when someone overseas registers, and they check one of the boxes where they have no intention of returning, or they don't know when they're going to be returning, they may never have lived in the U.S., but they get an application, and all we have when we do the mail ballot is their signature. And we can't really challenge anything other than that because we don't know and how they got to register in a county they have no affiliation with. So it seems that would be a loophole for people who want to target and maybe flip close elections as to get people overseas to go register in a county. I don't know how they get assigned that way when they don't have any tie. So you mentioned it before, so if that's something that would be included in the app.
And I've sent language to some Texas lawmakers on that very thing, because the Supreme Court decision on requiring documented proof of citizenship doesn't apply to the overseas people voting under UOCAVA. UOCAVA is another one of those laws that Congress broke it, Congress needs to fix it. We need to divide it between military and civilian, because what's happened is that the focus has been on the civilian, and the Democrats have been trying to drive up the civilian overseas vote for doing just manipulating it, having people register in states they've never had any relationship with. But we also, what's happened is that we've seen a decline in military and deployed military voting. So we need to separate those and let them be run separately. We have a whole proposal on that, Congressman. And but states have a lot of authority, and they just need to exercise it. But we have to get legislators to understand. It's interesting. Talk about a paradigm shift that Congressman was talking about. I would say Georgia's had a real paradigm shift since 2020, because now you have all kinds of Republican legislators introducing bills on election reform. That's such, I don't agree with all the things they're doing, but we can mobilize the grassroots to tweak them. But the fact that they're even thinking about it, for decades, that's just been Democrats. So and now there are several legislators in Texas who are working on some things. We just need to keep pushing them to do this heavy lifting. It's very nerdy and very granular. I spent a week ago, with these guys who've been working on voter rolls. They're engineers and data software people. I'm a freaking lawyer. I don't have any idea what they're talking about. Just tell me what the situation is, and I'll go talk to the congressman.
So residency for overseas voters is a state function, so there's that potential to look at that. I would say, we didn't really mention it, but the USPS and the performance of that was a huge issue in this past election. And you have to understand that, you've got to give, if you're going to vote absentee or by mail, you got to put that ballot 7 days before the election. And we had to convince the head of the post office to put that out there publicly because, look, you don't want to wait till the last day and put your ballot in the mail and not have it counted. But I just saw a headline today. First of all, DeJoy, Postmaster General, has resigned. And the president is again going to push for privatization of USPS, the post office, the postal service. That would have a dramatic effect on elections. Because if they're involved in elections as a private institution, there may be multiple private institutions. It could once again sort of change how we vote, the methods of voting, and something to think about. But if we're going to use vote by mail, if you're going to use absentee, and a lot of folks do, you guys got to be aware of the post office, and they've got to perform and to be accountable.
Great.
I was wondering, do you think you're going to have time to pass the law that needs to be passed so that we don't end up with 2026 having all these issues about California and Pennsylvania like we had in 2024?
The short answer is yes. Not only do we must. And I think the biggest difference here is as we move legislation through the House, for the first time, we now have Republican partners in the Senate, and Senator Thune has an opportunity to bring it forward and have it pass. I mean, when you look at this list that Cleta Mitchell put forward, some of these ideas are 86% popular. I think they're actually higher, but they're 86% popular off of one poll. And so if we pass that in the House, we elevate the issues so the American people understand it, know that it's coming before the Senate, leverage the bully pulpit of the president, leverage the grassroots organizations. When the Senate brings that up, I think we can cross the 60-vote threshold. And then it'll be implemented into law. Short answer is absolutely we have the time, but I think it's essential that not only do we have the time, that we get it done and we place the pressure to get it all the way across the law, all the way across the line, signed into law.
Thank you.
Josh, I guess respond.
Yes.
Just very briefly, I think this is, the president has a real opportunity, and the Congress, the Speaker particularly, we have adopted the new standards, and we're trying to implement those new standards for more paper and more accuracy in voting. So this is a real opportunity to improve those voting machines.
Thank you. Okay, I believe we got a question in the back, and then we'll go to a few on this side.
Meg Wilson, I've worked locally in my elections as long, 10, 20 years. But I have a concern from the previous panel, China. If we're going to do all this data transfer, please make sure that the Chinese can't get into it.
Well, I think that one of the changes that we need to make, look, after 2000's presidential election, Congress passed, a Republican-controlled Congress, I might add, passed the Help America Vote Act. And one of the primary purpose of that law was to forbid and to outlaw punch card voting systems and the old lever machines. And Congress appropriated a lot of money to the states to replace those systems. That's 22 years ago. The technology, as the Congressman and Mr. Chairman have both pointed out, the technology has changed. And we need, I believe very strongly, and I'm not a techie. I always say I can barely work my iPhone, but we should not have a voting system that even has the capability of remote access, period. No remote access. Hand-marked ballots, no ballot marking devices, no touch screens. I mean, those are simple things that the people know. Every election, we hear all these reports about people punching on their touch screen, and it says the opposite of what they're trying to do. We need to limit we need to make eligibility standards to vote by mail. And everybody else should vote in person, because when you don't vote in person, all of the safeguards for the secret ballot against political manipulation and pressure all go out the window. We need supervised voting. Then you have observers, you have election workers who can help people. I mean, these are basic things that the left has disrupted over the last decade. That's what they spent their money doing. And we have to return to these common sense precinct voting, and we can do, most people voting in person, eliminate these 45 days of early voting, because that costs the jurisdiction so much money. I mean, and it's not transparent. There is so much that we know that needs to be done to protect the elections. But number one, if you don't have remote access capability at all, guess what? Then you remove the threat of any kind of manipulation. You remove the threat of what happened in Georgia in 2020 in October, when Dominion sent through remotely a critical software update. Well, who knows what that was? So I'm just saying, we know what needs to be done. We just have to have the will to do it. And the databases.
Thank you. Yes, let's start with the question in the back.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say I've been the central count judge for Hays County for 6 years. And I have to just totally disagree with you about hand-marked ballots. The mail-in ballots are hand-marked, and they are the biggest mess. Trying to figure out what these people do that scratch through things, draw circles and lines. I remember one ballot came in, the only thing they voted for was the presidential election. There was a check in one box and an X in the other, and a note, I changed my mind. Okay, back when Beto was running, so many people didn't vote in the box. They went down, and underneath they wrote Beto, the Mexican one. So I can tell you, if we need to have a device that marks the ballot, so if people change their minds, it prints out, and then the person has the responsibility to look at the printout and see that it's what they intended. If not, they can get another ballot and mark it again. So it's going to be much faster, much easier if you have a device that marks it, and just make sure everybody checks it. I know not only am I the central count judge, but I'm also the tech that fixes all the machines when something happens out in the polling places. And I'm always reminding everybody, always read the ballot before you put it in the box. So that's what I would prefer, that we have machines that mark the ballots. If you want to do the counting by hand, okay, it's going to take forever to do that, but mark them with a machine so it's clear what they really want. You don't have that terrible mess. Thank you.
There's a difference between hand-marked and hand counting. Those are two different things. And the system used in my county in North Carolina is you mark it by hand, and then you put it in the tabulator. And if you have double marked or you haven't done it right, it spits it back out while you're there. And that's one of the reasons what you're describing is one of the reasons I think we shouldn't have universal vote by mail. Because now what's cropped up since then is all these post-election ballot curing and, ballot chasing. And no, get your ballot in. But I think if you had precinct voting, more people voting in person, you have observation, you have election workers there to help. But I think that there's no way to have hand counting unless you really require precinct voting and you limit the size of precincts. I don't know that we want to get that granular in federal legislation. But I do think that there are some basic building blocks that have been eliminated. We need to rebuild those.
Yeah. More questions on this side. Oh, we've got a lot. Let's come up to the front a little bit. Sure. Let's go there and then work our way up.
A couple of the states took several weeks to finish counting their votes. What can we do to speed up the process so that people are confident that when their votes happen, they will know the election results soon rather than weeks afterwards?
Well, Arizona just passed a bill, which was vetoed by the governor this week, that would have required turning in your, they allow people to receive a mail ballot, vote it at home, and then return it. And hundreds of thousands of those are returned on Election Day. And they had a bill that would have required those to all be turned in by Friday before the election. Also required in-person voting people to be able to put their votes into the tabulators before they leave the vote centers. And also require schools to be able to require schools to have voting locations, polling locations in the schools. The governor vetoed it. It's going to go on the ballot as a referendum. That would help a lot. Those measures would help a lot in Arizona, and that's one of the states that you're talking about. California, Chairman, you're going to have to fix California.
States that allow ballots to arrive after the polls close cause a lot of problems. And so if you contrast that with Florida or Wisconsin, where the ballots have to be in by the time the polls close, that avoids that challenge. So as noted with California, I went out to California after the election to LA Central County. LA County is 10 million people, and they count all the ballots at one location, centralized in LA County. And on Election Day, they're driving all the ballots over to the central count. Some of them come in by helicopter into the central count location because of LA traffic. And then ballots continue to arrive through USPS for days. And then they have a curing process, going back to the gentleman's comment in the back, where people are voting by mail. They may check a box, forget to date it, whatever it is. And then they go back, they try to find the person, they bring them back. It causes people a lot of, it reduces people's confidence in the elections as you watch this process play out. And the Democrats are really good at working the curing game, which is how you watch these votes tally drop down for people like John Duarte or Michelle Steil, Mike Garcia, three great Republican members that all lost their races in close races that touch or are near LA County. And so the real answer is you should have your ballot in by the time your polls close at your given state. And the way that I think about this, which is apparently 85% approved, 12% disapproved, according to Ms. Mitchell. But in a serious sense, I think a lot about this law concept. It's the same principle that was there when you were in high school or college and a paper was due at 5 p.m. on Thursday. Some people did it like 3 weeks early, they turned it in, and that one person is probably doing really well in life. Everybody else finished it somewhere between 4 and 4:45 or 5 p.m. on the day it was due. So saying that you have to have it mailed in by Election Day, what we're really doing is encouraging, just like you would if you were teaching a high school class, you're encouraging everybody to mail it in on Election Day, exacerbating the problem because the actual number of ballots then that come in after the polls close in those states is large. If you say you got to have it in by the time the polls close on your Election Day, as they do in the state of Wisconsin, people get it in either early or better yet, show up and vote in person in the state of Wisconsin.
Yeah, I mean, I think voters will adjust, and I think, look, Florida is actually the prime example. I mean, I remember the governors waiting on the phone, waiting for Palm Beach, and that just wasn't a great scene. And so they passed a law that basically said, this is the deadline, the results have to be in by this time, and you have to adjust your procedures to make it work. And it has worked. And guess what? Florida elections improved even more. Right. So I think that...
And we know who won within like an hour or two of the polls closing.
Exactly. And look, even California, I know a little bit of scoop here. Even California is pretty funny. There was a legislator, I won't name that person, complaining about why it's taking so long because they feel the heat and for the lack of confidence, and the Secretary of State and some of the association went to them and said, well, it's your law that's is requiring this to be so many weeks after the election. Oh, I might need to change that. And so there are consequences to actions. And look, there is a recognition that this decreases voter confidence. And so I think that it's one of those 85%, and then we'll fill in the details later about how we get there.
That's right. All right, we've got time for one more question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask the last question. We've got one over here that's been waiting for a long time. So our last question from the audience.
Thank you for this. In 2020, there was a number of states that did things that was against their legislature. Happened here in Texas. The governor said, we'll add another week on to early voting. I don't know what the answer is, but how do you address that situation? The states went to the Supreme Court and they said, we're not going to hear that. So where else do you go? I don't have an answer. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Thank you.
I can give you a couple nuggets on this, and we'll pass it off. One is in 2020, the attorneys for President Trump did a very poor job of engaging early and filing lawsuits before the election date. I think we saw improvement, going back to improvements of 2024, there was engagement on the front end where we had the opportunity to prevent some of the changes that you're referencing. We saw that in my home state of Wisconsin where they're doing ballot collections in the park and deputizing. There's a lack of engagement by Trump's legal team in 2020 that we didn't see in 2024. In the state of Wisconsin, you may or may not know, we have a huge Supreme Court race coming up. And in the state of Wisconsin, we have an opportunity to get common sense back on the Supreme Court instead of radical liberals on the Supreme Court on April 1. Wisconsin's a little unique. Not every state elects their Supreme Court, but we have a mission-critical election coming up where our current liberal Supreme Court just overturned the ability for people to sue when things aren't going right. And so there's a whole question about Zuckerbucks being used in the city of Racine, which is in my congressional district, and the manner in which they use them to drive forward a partisan advantage in the election. And our liberal Supreme Court just said, no, you can't move forward with this lawsuit, which is the whole frustration of the point. And so the importance of the courts writ large, from the U.S. Supreme Court to our federal judges and our state Supreme Courts and our state court systems, is to make sure that we have people with common sense on the courts rather than radical liberals who are trying to advance a political agenda.
I would just say that when you have a natural disaster or like a pandemic, the rules and sort of flexibility to the governor or the election official should be in advance, right? We should know what sort of flexibility there is. What happens, and we saw that in North Carolina, is when you don't have that flexibility, then someone's going to fill the gap. And the legislature in that case came in, they reconvened and they passed some legislation, but that doesn't often happen, particularly if it's election day, right? There's no time for that. So I think that thinking about how we will handle a natural disaster or a man-made disaster or a pandemic in the future is important. What flexibility do we want to give the governor or the election officials?
But as noted, where North Carolina actually reconvened their government and passed a law, that is way better than the unilateral action that we saw states take well in advance of the election, where the state assembly, state senator, their governor refused to act. They did it through fiat, which is a huge problem.
Well, and I can just tell you, I was, as one of President Trump's lawyers in Georgia, we brought an election contest after the November 2020 election because we went through and we saw all these problems where the law had been violated. We filed a 64-page complaint, election contest under state law with over 1,100 pages of affidavits, expert witness reports, and evidence showing how the election laws of the state of Georgia had been violated, and there were more votes that had been cast in violation of state law than the margin of difference between President Trump and Joe Biden. And under Georgia law, the remedy is a new election. Well, guess what? Georgia was going to have another statewide election in January because they have that stupid runoff law. But guess what? And this had never happened. I've never seen this before. We didn't get a judge appointed to hear the case. I've never heard of that until literally the day before the electoral votes were certified, so it rendered the case moot. So we had to dismiss that case, and we never got to present the evidence. So, one of the things, and if you look at principle number 10 on the U.S. Citizens Election Bill of Rights, going to what the chairman was talking about, citizens standing. Citizens should have standing to enforce the election laws. The election laws need to be self-executing. Right now, what happens is you have these left-wing groups that come in, and they can just be a paper organization that doesn't really exist. They always have standing. But you have candidates, Republican candidates. You had the President of the United States in the case of 2020, and you have citizens, and we're always told we don't have standing. We have no standing. 6 congressmen in Pennsylvania filed a suit in September because the state election office officials were not enforcing the law on identity of people trying to vote under Yokava. And the judge dismissed it because it said that those members of Congress didn't have standing. So we need to fix the standing laws to give citizens, political parties, candidates the opportunity to enforce the laws and to make it harder for people to just overturn and go judge shopping to overturn election laws that are duly enacted by the legislature.
Keep in mind what Cleta said. This is important. It's not that they didn't get a decision. It's that they didn't even get a judge appointed. That is why races like the Wisconsin Supreme Court race matter. All right, we are at time, but I'm still going to ask one last question, so feel free to answer as short as you want. I love predictions, right? If this was a sports podcast, I'd be asking for the prediction on who's going to win. But here's the prediction that I'm going to ask for. What are the trends or issues? We just came off this big win. What are the trends or issues that we need to pay attention to for the 25-26 election cycle?
I'd say citizen standing and transparency laws to be able to hold people accountable, election officials accountable, to make sure they follow the law and that they get it right, and if they don't get it right, that they're held responsible. That and cleaning the voter rolls and making sure that we pass the SAVE Act and clean up the federal statutes. So that's it's a wish list. I don't know if that's a prediction. That's my wish list.
I'll build on the citizenship and say the campaign finance side, and in particular foreign funding.
So for trends, maybe I'm being hopeful here. Putting into concrete the changes that have happened from 2020 to 2024, folks, like this organization and other organizations that are involved in election integrity, we want to keep that sort of infrastructure in place.
Can I say one thing before we leave?
Yes.
I wanted to give a shout out to Josh and to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, to Byron, to Annalise. I first met Josh in May of 2021 when he came over to see me at CPI and said that he'd just been hired to run the election integrity unit at the RNC. And I have to tell you that we worked hand in glove. Josh was at all of our state integrity summits in 2022. And we had a big repair job to do with the grassroots because they basically hate the party, with good reason in many cases. But Josh he has a great feel and a great heart, not only for the subject matter, but for the grassroots. And so I was absolutely delighted when Josh told me that he was going to be joining the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We worked hand in glove and had weekly calls all through 2024 to work together to see where the needs were and where we could fill in the gaps and try to help those people on the ground make sure that they were holding their election officials accountable. So I'm just very grateful to you and your team and the TPPF.
Thank you. I hate to end on that, but we will. Please join me in thanking our panelists.